right. Hello, everybody. I'm here with Mary Elizabeth Huber. She's an apprentice iconographer, an artist, and painter. She recently, I commissioned, I guess you can say, for her to paint me Saint Muirgen, or otherwise known as Liban. She's a mermaid saint that kind of, you can say, picked me. I don't think we usually choose our saint friends. I think they pick us. Um, but yeah, welcome, Mary, and I'm excited to talk to you about how you approach painting and art and your draw into iconography and talking about your process in making St. Muirgen for me.
Me too. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah. So just as a quick background, I guess, I know you went to SCAD, right? Is that where you kind of like started studying? So how did you get to that decision to want to kind of like study art and drawing specifically? I know you did some digital like drawing and stuff before getting to painting, and just kind of your process to where you are currently.
Well, drawing was always my escape. I was a very introverted kid who loved to, every morning I would go get the newspaper and I would read all the newspaper comics, and I was obsessed with Charlie Brown and Calvin and Hobbes and these comic strips that were leaning more on like philosophical, political commentaries. And so my dream was I wanted to do a newspaper comic strip, but this was in the early 2000s when newspapers were kind of on their way out. And my dad was like, "You'll never make a living." So I just drew on the side, just thinking that eventually I would find myself into a normal job. But that just never really happened. I never really did that good in school or had any idea of what I wanted to do with my life other than drawing. Like, drawing was the only thing I thought I was good at. And by the time I got to the end of high school, I was kind of a high school dropout at that point. I just didn't think I was going to go to college. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And then I had this friend who was getting into all these art schools, and she got into SCAD. And then I found that they had all these illustration and sequential art and animation programs, and that there was this whole industry for animation. And I was like, that's what I want to do. So I went to SCAD. Long story short, I graduated and moved to LA trying to pursue the animation industry, which was a lot more cutthroat and competitive, more so than I thought it would be. And never really got anywhere with that until COVID hit and LA pretty much shut down. And I moved home and was kind of in this limbo before discovering Jonathan Pajot's YouTube channel. And he said he was an icon carver, and I had no idea what icons were at the time. Like, I had seen icons, but I just thought they were another form of Christian art that looked really weird. I thought Byzantine art was really weird, and I just didn't know anything about it. But as I went down, I started watching his videos and learning about symbology and just the way he described the world, because I considered myself agnostic most of my life, even though I grew up the cradle Catholic. I just was on a mission to figure out how to be a good person but do whatever I wanted at the same time. And then listening to Jonathan talk about the world in such a mystical, magical way just really resonated with my childhood self that really wanted to believe in mermaids and fairies and angels and just see the world more than how it was. And that just blew my mind. And ever since then, I've just been obsessed with icons and revolved my whole life around God and portraying his image. And like you just said a moment ago, saints pick you. And just going from that really materialist worldview to where I am now has been just so surreal, and I'm just so thankful for it.
Yeah, I mean, Pajot is a big influence in my life too. I similarly, I had like a reversion, and I started getting into like started watching all these like YouTube personalities because I was just researching. At some point, I felt like I was carrying Catholicism as like a dead body behind me. Like, I was just kind of dragging it along with me. And at some point I was like, I either believe in this or I just got to cut the cord and say I don't believe this anymore. So I just did like more in-depth stuff. But eventually I remember on my YouTube feed Pajot's video with Jordan Peterson was always on my recommended thing, but I always ignored it. I was like, I don't even know who this guy is. Like, I'm not even interested. But the one time I ran out of stuff to watch, so I just like clicked it and I had it on the background as I was working. And he started describing like the symbolism of Mary. And I remember thinking like, what do you mean the symbolism of Mary? Like, what does that even mean? But as he was discussing it, there's something like in my heart that he just like unlocked and gave me like this language that was missing, that I always knew existed, but I never knew how to talk about it. And so I became like a huge fan. And like, I mean, honestly, the one reason I do this is because of him, because I thought his work was just so phenomenal. And I remember watching some of his Q&As and people would ask him like, do you believe Santa Claus is real? And without a beat, he would just be like, of course it's real. I mean, it's like a different form of existence, but of course he's real. And so I kind of like his thought process. But is there, what kind of, so was iconography a draw to you because it was, you felt like a connecting point in the faith? Or did you like kind of like the mystery behind them when you found out there's like a deeper meaning with it? Like, what do you think was kind of that draw into icons?
Well, when I look back on the artwork that I was doing in college, back before I had any idea of what I was doing, just trying new things, I see now little bits and pieces of iconography in my work. Like, I was always really attracted to symmetry, big eyes, simple yet volumetric forms, and it just, once I discovered it, it kind of fit like a glove, which makes me more, you know how Jordan Peterson will talk about like Carl Jung and the archetypes and how we kind of carry these stories in our DNA. So it's almost like I kind of was able to look at myself full circle and see like, could this be my destiny? Like, was this what I was looking for the whole time? And if that is the case, that makes sense why I never really fit in LA. I never really fit in any of these circles that I was trying to, these like almost anti-God circles that I was trying to get into. It was just really amazing. And now I'm discovering all these artists like Harry Clark. He's like this stained glass artist in Ireland, and he would do religious figures with like the really big eyes and the really bright colors. But he would also do fairy tale illustration for like The Little Mermaid and Faust. And you can kind of see how that style can bend both ways, where it can be like really charming and sweet religious imagery, but also really dark and creepy, cartoonish, occult imagery. And he kind of, towards the end of his life, he kind of went more down the dark end. But that was something that was always really disturbing to me about Disney movies and just that whole cartoon world in general, was just how dark it could get when you didn't really have that balance between good and evil, I guess. So I would get really uncomfortable at comic book conventions, as you can imagine. But so that's why iconography, the more I get into it, the more I feel I resonate with it. And I'm also really amazed at how much it resonates with other people, especially non-believers. Like yesterday, I was at a dinner party with a bunch of like engineer, just very mathy, technical people who are like, oh, I don't have an artistic bone in my body. But when I was talking to them about iconography, they like lit up and they were so interested in it. And I was like, I never had this kind of thing happen when I was trying to work in animation. People would be like, oh, that's cool, whatever. But when you talk about icons, even atheists are like, just it's amazing. I think they're going to help change the world for sure.
Yeah, I did. I was just at a Renaissance festival with Jacqueline, and you know, I enjoyed the Renaissance festival, and I like if I don't see why you would go to the Renaissance festival, for example, without like dressing up. So like,
yeah.
I had like some kind of like just like squire knight kind of thing, and she had like this kind of medieval style dress and stuff, and we went. But there are so many people there that I identified as, I don't know, YouTube might dox me for using this language or whatever, but I'm not sure the algorithm stuff yet. But there was a lot of people that would identify within like the queer kind of ideology and stuff. There was like a lot of people wearing the rainbow pins or like the trans pins and stuff on their costumes or whatever. Mm-hmm. And we saw like men wearing medieval style dresses, but also being dressed as fairies. Like it was all kind of like crazy and all over the place. And then you would go to like the stores, and obviously they would have like jewelry, but it was from every single kind of like pagan uh religious line, but not the Christian one, right? Like there's no crucifix or anything anywhere. The only exception was like the Celtic cross, but they don't really view that as like Christian. They associate it more with just like Celtic culture. And so you have the hammer of Odin and or hammer of Thor and all this other stuff. And part of me wanted to be like, man, we should just like next year as vendors, even though we're not, just open like a rosary store and sell rosaries or something. But I also mentioned that because last year I went and I was dressed up as a priest. I had like a long white robe and I had this like cross scepter. And I had so many reactions to that. Like people would walk up to me and be like, "Can you bless my beers?" And I would actually in Latin like do the sign of the cross and do like the in nomine Domini Patre Filio Spiritus, and they were like blown away and they're like, "Oh my gosh, you're like the real thing." But you would see them light up. You know what I mean? I had this woman that walked past me and just stared at me, and I was like, "Can I help you?" And she was like, "Yeah, can I take a picture with you?" And I was like, "Sure." And I mean, my costume was nothing that impressive, right? Like you probably could have bought this robe or whatever from Walmart during Halloween or Spirit Halloween or something. Like it wasn't like I went all out with some of these cosplayers. But there's something about it where, I mean, there's a real reaction that people have to it. And so like what you were saying, like I can see iconography kind of like seeing that imagery also like speaking to somebody's heart. And before we go into, you know, your process for painting or writing Saint Muirgen, what is, and I know you're going into apprenticeship, like I mentioned in the beginning, of into iconography, right? You're going into a school of iconography. So from what your understanding is, what is an icon, and what makes it different from just, you know, a painting you see at a museum or a gallery?
I mean, there's a lot of different descriptions for them, but for me, the window to heaven is a really good one, because like they say, the screens on our phones, like the black mirrors, they're like windows to the world, windows to knowledge, whereas the icons are windows to heaven, as far as like the layering processes and the journey that the artist has to go through to make them. But also a good way that I like to think about them is they're kind of like anchors for your mind to stay focused when you are doing contemplative prayer, or really any type of prayer. But I'm trying to get really more into that kind of prayer where you're just being, and an icon is really good for just kind of keeping you centered in that process, particularly with the eyes. So that's why I really try to focus on the human countenance and just the eyes. So like when I was planning Morgan's painting, I wanted to make it big so that I could get her whole figure, but also really get in on the face and see like how I could connect with her as a person. Because what was so challenging about her was that there was just not that much information about her at first glance. So trying to connect with her as a person and what made her human and how I could identify with her, and like how I could just kind of see the world through her eyes in a way. Because it was so weird, because she was like a mermaid. She was so far away. She seemed so distant. But once I got her face down, it was like the rest of the image kind of outwardly spiraled and came to life. So that's kind of that's why I get so attached to these icons when I'm painting them. Like when I'm not painting her, I would keep her by my bed at night and kind of just look at her to get ideas, but also to see like, can I pray with this person? Like, can I connect with Christ in a different way through this image? And I've noticed a big difference from when I don't have them in my room to when I don't, or when I do. So in this day and age where praying is so difficult to do because we're so distracted and we have so many things going on, something as simple as just having like a 2D image of Christ or Morgan or Mary can make all the difference. Like I really do think they're going to help people heal their minds and get back into this like contemplative prayer process.
Yeah. So how does that make it different from, what if someone is like, yeah, I agree with you, but to me, that's what an image of Superman does. It sounds ridiculous, but how would you separate? Like, I don't like in some case you can argue that you can have an icon of Superman, but I guess his icon would have limits compared to one of a saint or of like Christ, obviously. But I
Hmm.
wonder what your take on that is.
I was thinking about that recently, like Batman, how Batman is kind of like a Christ figure. Because there are a lot of, I used to try to do like the whole variant superhero covers when I was in college, because there was like a big, like the comic book people, like superheroes are like their gods. And you'll see like a comic book cover of Wonder Woman that's structured very similarly to a religious icon. So, yeah, I mean, there are people who like having those images around for that same reason. But like when you think of something like Batman and how his story is kind of like this perpetual struggle between him and the Joker and how they can't exist without each other, it's kind of I mean, that's a really good question, because it's like, when does it ever end? Like, when does Batman finally defeat the Joker? It's just like this never ending struggle versus, Christ versus Satan, where there
Well,
is
Batman defeats
redemption.
the Joker by dying.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
Well, I'm not
This
even
is more
talking
like,
about the lore itself, but like you were connecting the example between Christ and Satan, like that's how you can say Christ defeated the Jokers by dying.
yeah,
And so, you know, the Joker always says his only purpose is to kind of like mess with Batman.
right.
The thing that becomes tricky is, in some way, Batman would have to let the Joker kill him. Like, it can obviously couldn't be like a suicide where Batman just like ousts himself. But
Wait, so what actually happened when, and that would, like, so did Joker kill Batman, or?
I mean, I don't know the specific story. I don't even know if that's. I never read that comic book. I was just like connecting the symbolism as far as like if you're looking at Batman as Christ or vice versa, right? Like the way Christ defeats the ultimate villain is basically by through death, right? Like there's the hymns, especially here with the Byzantine liturgy, where he's like Christ trampled death by death. Like that's how you defeated him. So because the Joker's only purpose is to mess with Batman, right? If he succeeds and actually gets what he wants, at that point he loses his purpose, and eventually he himself would, being that the Joker's evil, he would probably oust himself at some point because he would have no purpose left. And
Right.
so, um, to kind of like continue that thread, it would be, yeah, Batman would have to, in a way, become a martyr in some way and die in a fight with the Joker. It's the same thing like what people say, like why you shouldn't take revenge. I mean, there's several reasons, but when you condense your meaning into just like avenging someone or having revenge, once you get it, like you lose all purpose. Where
Right.
with forgiveness, there's this sense that you almost in a sense get your revenge, but you can continue moving forward without just crossing the finish line and being done, right?
Yeah, kill him with kindness.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
guess that makes sense. I mean, if you get solace from having an image of Batman by your bed and it gets you through the struggles of life, then God bless you. But that hasn't been obvious to me. I see a lot of superhero fans who are still searching,
Yeah.
but I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's funny because I think Pajot in one of his videos says like, you're more than welcome to go to like Comic Cons and stuff and dress up as Jedis and stuff. The thing is, you'll never become a Jedi, but you can become a saint, right?
Yeah,
Like that's the thing. Is like sainthood is really rooted, you can say, within our reality. So like you can dress up with them, you can have them as your role models, and you'll actually see yourself change in virtue, and you'll become a saint, right? Like as if you follow like the route of the Jedi or of Batman or whatever, it ends at Comic Con. Like that's the final place where you end up. Like there's nothing beyond that.
Yeah, I could see how Batman, like a few years ago, I was kind of obsessed with Batman and Batgirl, thinking like how the world was kind of turning into a Gotham City and everything's being run by clowns, and just how awesome it would be if I could learn like advanced martial arts and get a motorcycle and go and like deliver justice where nobody else was doing it. But at the end of the day, it is a fantasy. Like, I'm not a billionaire. Elon Musk is nothing like Bruce Wayne, and it just, yeah, I kind of outgrew it, which sounds weird to say, but I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna go. Jesus is way cooler. No offense. But,
Yeah.
so
No, I get that. And which is a good segue into the so as the world becomes more, you can say, crazy and sinful, you can see what kind of like Pajot talks about as like more of the monsters coming in, right? Like you have, and the thing is, it's like it's not arbitrary anymore. It's like I said, I went to the Renaissance Festival and there's literally guys dressed as fairy princesses, right? Like it's like this this chimera type of mix thing where usually fairies are viewed a little more feminine and stuff, but here's like this big hairy burly guy trying to look like this petite kind of like figure or whatever.
mhm.
And then with all the other stuff going on, but there's an interesting fact where there's a monster in itself is not evil, right? It's like you have the cherubim outside the garden that is described like a monster, where he has a head of a head of a bull, I think legs of an eagle or something, and then a head of a man. Like he's has like all these different forms to himself, and he's outside of the garden protecting, making sure no one goes in.
Yeah,
And then there's the other side of that where there's, you can say, dragons, and they don't necessarily protect you, they just want to eat you, right? So there's like two different types of monsters. But as we get into this weirder world, at least in my experience, I see like weirder saints pop up too. Like, Pajot talks a lot about the dog-headed man of Saint Christopher, or like in the Western world, he was viewed as a giant, so he was like really big. In my own life, it was Saint Muirgen. So like Saint Muirgen, I saw her once. I'm a big fan of like mermaid mythology and like anything to do with the sea and stuff in general. So when
yeah,
I found out that there was a saint, like a medieval saint that was also a mermaid, that something really attracted that to me. And I could only find one picture of her, and it wasn't even a picture, it's like a carving in stone, right? And it's in kind of like that weird medieval style with that kind of like lax detail and stuff.
right.
And like you said, I could find so little information for her, but all I can find was the general basic myth around her that um her town, the town flooded that she was in, I believe, and then she found kind of like this cavern with a pocket in it, and she stayed there. And I believe a goddess appeared to her and gave her like 300 years of life or whatever, and but she would be basically like a mermaid, and she had a pet dog that was a sea otter. And then later, the whole, then there's the whole thing with the ship that comes, and basically there's a priest on there that's a saint also, that basically says like, if you can have eternal life but you'll die right now, or you can
Right.
continue living on your 300 years as you are. And she chooses the eternal life thing. And so, she gets baptized. I believe she receives the Eucharist and then dies shortly after. But I found it really intriguing. So I would be curious to learn kind of like how you went about finding research beyond just Googling like I did. Or if that was it. And then how you went about kind of really learning her to craft like a new image, like almost like bring back a memory of her to some extent.
Yeah. Um, it was kind of the same for me at first. It was like there's such little information, but the little facts that you find, you can unpack into deeper things. Like when we were doing our Bible study, it's like the story of Adam and Eve isn't like super detailed at first reading, but once you go into it, you find like all of these side stories that you can kind of piece together in your brain. So that kind of was the road I was going down, as far, and also seeing all the parallels with Hans Christian Andersen and that Little Mermaid story. I was like, there's no way he didn't know. Like, maybe he didn't know, but I'm sure he did tons of research on mermaid mythology when he was writing his story. And the parallels between those two, I was like, there has to be something in here that's like we carry in our, like, I don't know, for lack of a better term, ancestral DNA. Maybe at one point we were like living side by side with mermaids. But I've always also like really loved Irish culture and mythology. I haven't been there, but my dad's grandmother was Irish, and I come from a long line of Irish Marys. So that's something I carry with me, and I don't fully understand yet. But I used a lot of my memories as a kid and listening to Irish music. I think music is also really important, especially with any creative endeavor. It can transport you and help conjure imagery in your heads and even give you memories maybe you don't even know, if that makes any sense, like that synthesia phenomenon. So I just knew I really wanted to portray a sense of like hopeful melancholy with the painting, because when you think about the story from like a human perspective, like to have your family drown and have your home destroyed in a flood and be alone, the lone survivor in like a small little cavern, that's pretty traumatic, I would imagine. Like that's a really just horrifying thing to happen to somebody. And I found there were some texts that kind of went into her, like her father and maybe like the tribes he was conflicting with or whatever. But just that feeling of being alone with great loss and the mourning that she was carrying was very similar to kind of my own journey back to Christ, like that way that God kind of lets us have these periods of tragedy and isolation from the world so that we have nowhere else to turn to but him, and how that could have been the case for her. So I kind of pieced together little things that I know about Ireland. So for example, her face was inspired by this painting that is on Irish banknotes. I forgot the woman's name, but if you look at like Irish money, there's this amazing painting of a woman who has, I think, very distinctive Irish features, like really big eyes, like kind of a swoopy elfish nose and like light skin and just kind of this like almost mischievous look. And I watched a lot of videos of Irish lake scuba diving to get ideas of how the fish and the greenery would look, and looking at videos of otters and abandoned medieval monasteries, and just somehow kind of capturing that mood of, you know, she was 300 years in isolation, and she was raised pagan, so she prayed to Danu, I think is her name. So she was like the Celtic mother goddess. And I thought it was really interesting how she only granted like half of her prayer and then kind of kept her soul in limbo, which I felt was very similar to the story of the Little Mermaid, where she kind of like made a deal with a witch and didn't really get exactly what she wanted. So maybe somehow that ties into like, I don't know, pagan gods and demons and holding your soul limbo. But then the redemption that she gets through death and kind of this resurrection, which is similar to the Little Mermaid. Like she refuses to kill the prince and she dies in his place. And then she's rewarded by becoming like a spirit of the air and gets to live forever in a sense. So that's why I'm like, oh, Hans Christian Andersen somehow had to have known this story, and how that could be, like how to talk about that in the sense, like when you talk to people about these kind of things, they're like, what, you believe in mermaids or you believe in monsters or giants and all that stuff, but how it affects culture, like the Little Mermaid has permeated culture for hundreds of years and has shape shifted over time. But maybe Muirgen can be kind of our return to what this story really means for us. You know what I mean? So I'd be interested in hear your thoughts on that.
No, yeah, I mean, I think one thing is when stories were told back in the day, I honestly think that, you know, a lot of the older stories don't have authors, and it's said that they didn't record them, and I think it's on purpose, and you might say, well, that's obvious. But I think it was because like there was an understanding that there was like a shared human experience, right? Where now with authorship, it's it's almost like each individual author has like authorship about the meaning of their stories too. And so as back in the day, if you talked about water, everybody knew that you were talking about the same kind of like experience. Like you got wet, it was probably cold, it was chaotic, like if you went too far you could probably drown and die, like right. And so you had this kind of like, and no matter where you told the stories, whether you were in Ireland or Persia or whatever, people had a similar understanding of water. Whereas now an art, like when someone's writing, they almost become a tyrant in their stories, because you might think like, oh, I kind of understand what he's talking about with water, and they could say like, no, that's not what it means. The water is you know, it's actually my mother, like it's a symbolism of my mother and that, right? Which that can happen too, but it kind of shifted of how we think of stories. So we think everything's arbitrary now. Like when we think of those kind of stories, we're just like, oh, some author just made it up because it probably symbolized like his family or what made him comfortable, instead of all encapsulating almost like, it sounds kind of new agey, but like this collective human experience or consciousness that understands this story. And what's interesting is like, when you look at fairy tales and other stuff, you can actually understand scripture better too. Because like in icons, as sure you're familiar, like Christ is born in a cave, right? And so you can connect that with Saint Morgan's story. Like has to be some kind of connection with her, almost have, even though it's through like a pagan goddess, she's like having almost a rebirth or something in that cave. And Christ is being born in a cave too, right? But and then there's that additional thing where you, like you said, like this principality, this goddess only grants half her wish. And it's the same thing you can think of like our own experience. Like if you worship an idol, they never give you the fullness of what you're expecting, right? So you'll only get half the enjoyment out of it because it just doesn't fulfill you. So like all that stuff, like all that meaning and stuff in there, we all kind of get it, but we're almost scared to interact with it because we're like, I don't know who this author was, so I can't interact because I don't know who the author is. Like now you almost have to do research about the director or who the author is before you can understand the story. And if you get rid of, I'm not necessarily advocating for this. I don't know how you get around it, but when there was no authors, right? Like you didn't have to know who the author is. You just kind of understood the story as a collective. It's the same thing with, if you think of like culture, like you can, like Polish people have pierogies. No one thinks necessarily and wonders like, how am I supposed to feel about pierogies? Who was the original inventor? You just eat them and enjoy them. You have them with your family, right? And that's the same way stories work. It's just like you were around the campfire, you told the stories, and it didn't matter who told it originally. You just kind of understood it. We just knew that we were all human. And so I think there's that kind of thing going on where if you just take a moment and just like set aside your materialist brain or lizard brain, whatever you want to call it, and just for 1 second, don't think of like Saint Morgan as this physical woman that's also half fish, but think of what it could mean to be a mermaid. I think that's something different. Like I always say, like modern day mermaids are basically OnlyFans models. Like OnlyFans is, I mean, it's serious. Like the internet is like kind of like the ocean. Like you can go and explore wherever you want, collect whatever knowledge or treasures you want. And along the way, there's these women that are like, seducing men to almost like come and watch them. And these guys throw their money at them and stuff, trying to get closer to them. But the thing is, they never get there. They end up, you can say, falling off their boat, like their moral boat or like their ethical boat, whatever you kind of be. Not that all these stories are just about morality. And they're kind of floating in this meaningless relationship of the internet, right? And so you can say mermaids are real. But if you're asking me if I believe that there's a half woman, half fish out there, that's not what I mean. I mean, with dragons, the same thing. Like, if you're asking me if there's flying biological lizards that breathe fire, no. But there was a dragon that appeared in 2020 during the George Floyd riots. Like, that's like a great example. If you went back, well, like think about it, right? Like not to be political about this, but but just looking at the kind of like experience of what happened, right? This man dies. You can almost say he was an offering, and people worshipped around him, putting their fists in the air, kneeling, bowing, whatever. And eventually that led to, and then eventually it led to like rioting, right? You had towns being set on fire and stuff. And if this was like medieval times, you would have wrote that story in a way where you was said like a man was offered up to, some darkness, and a dragon came out and was burning cities, flying around and burning cities in the US, right? So you can say it's like the dragon of Minnesota woke up and started burning cities around the US. That's what that's what the dragon is. The dragon is a force of destruction. And so, and then once again, I don't want to have political where this is like good or bad, but in some sense, if depending on how you look at it, you can view as that kid that shot that guy or whatever, almost as, that unwanted victim that just happened to slay the dragon. And after that, like the riot stopped, right? It's almost like he pierced the heart of the dragon, and then the riot stopped. So those are the way that people used to think about stories, and they were written in that way so that you don't get caught up too much in the details and stuff, because that doesn't necessarily matter as much. It's about the fullness of the picture, which is what icons do too, right? Like you have one image of a saint, and through that image you can tell almost the whole story about them.
Right.
Like there's the nature of them is just caught in that image. So that's kind of like my rant on whether mermaids or whatever and dragons are real.
Well, it's kind of, and it's like if you look at like Our Lady of Guadalupe, for example, like the people looked at her, and in just one image they could see like a virgin, pregnant queen crushing the dragon that demanded child sacrifice, and just that juxtaposition alone caused mass conversions and just a massive change across that whole continent. So yeah, icons have just immense power. Like visual language has such immense power. And as the years go by and the details get lost and just the meat of every story is all that's left behind, like we'll be able to kind of reclaim this way of thinking, like the way you're describing the crazy political stuff that's happening in our country right now. It's like maybe it's a lot of it has to do also with us kind of killing the magic of the world, like how we were talking about before, like we live on the same planet as Moses and Abraham. And if we believe in the Bible, which has some pretty, huge events that happen, but if you just cut all the trees down and pave over it, like these spirits, they don't go away. They just manifest in different ways. And it kind of feels like they're returning in a way.
Yeah, I mean, the image I think of is almost like a surgeon cutting open a man to find his soul. Like we all know a soul is real, but just because it's not material and you can't find it doesn't mean it's not real, right? And I feel like we do the same thing with stories. Where like we open them up and we expect to like open them and find a mermaid or something in there, and then we're like, oh, these stories are fake, and that. That kind of, I know some people that are even faithful that think it like fairy tales and stuff are ridiculous, but I think it's important because it helps us kind of like, I don't know how to phrase this. Not that it's all about just like, constantly being edgy or unique, but it helps us kind of interact with the world and understand what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. So, that kind of thought process of like thinking about St. Muirgen's story and stuff, and then later you're building a church, and then the church almost becomes an icon of her, right? Like everything you did in the image, if you were to build a church, you would showcase all of that in the pillars and in the altar and other stuff, but it would never be to St. Muirgen herself necessarily, but through her nature, it should be leading you up to Christ or God, right? Like it should elevate you beyond her story even. And I don't want to get like our churches today are just like the modern thing is like, that's why we have like white walls and stuff in most of their churches, and just a couple of statues just enough so you can tell it's Catholic. but like we don't go beyond. I know there's an issue with like money and all that other stuff, but you know, if people actually cared about it, there's always one person that I feel like is capable to maybe, let's say, invest or commission art to make churches more beautiful, which was done back in the day, but people don't do as often, unfortunately.
I was
Yeah.
just thinking about this, and
So,
what was it that made me leave the church for so many years? And a lot of it was just because of the dumbing down of the liturgy and the music. It just really just inflamed my pride and my intellect, I guess, but also just how just uninspiring and not beautiful the places of worship are. And with art, it really pays for itself. It's like a really good investment, I think, especially now. Like this one church I go to, they're having a lot of trouble fundraising for classrooms because they want to expand, but they're also at the same time struggling to find teachers to catechize the youth. So in my mind, I'm thinking if you instead invest in beautifying the space and inspiring people in to worship, then you will bring people who will not only expand their faith, but also want to share it with the youth. And then the classrooms will just come, like it'll pay for itself. But that's something we really lack in America, and maybe in Europe they just take it for granted at this point because they have the most beautiful churches in the world, and they're also having this. That was something I was also really learning about while painting Muirgen, what's going on specifically in Ireland, how they went from being one of the biggest catechizers of Europe to kind of having this return to paganism. And I don't know, maybe we just need like a new renaissance, because I've noticed artists, they tend to either kind of just glorify the Renaissance and want to go back to the old days, or they're more just kind of trying to play along with modern art and just try to make it Christian, but it doesn't really work. So it's like, where do we go from there, I guess?
yeah.
Like, we need something new and fresh, but not too new.
Yeah. I mean, the when you make an image or something, there should be a form that somebody can participate with it, right? So, you know, once again, an icon, you can use it for prayer. It lives in a church where people gather together, or you can use it in a procession. Like, there's different ways you can kind of participate with it.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, there's that classic kind of quote, I don't know who said it, but the museum is where art pieces go to die, because you kind of go there to just look at them, right? So a lot more people interact with art that's like outside in a village. Like if you have a roundabout and there's a statue there and stuff, you know, there's a community that's built around it, and maybe there's a legend around it. Like, I don't know, like that guy fought during the Civil War or something and fought off like 10 soldiers by himself or whatever, and this town is dedicated to that, right? And then people sell souvenirs. There's people that come, like it's something, that story is something that binds the city, and people can participate it through that sculpture of him or art forms of him. But if you're just making art for the sake for someone to just look at it, then it's it kind of just dies. I mean, it's the same thing with movies, right? The reason why Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and all those other ones are so successful is because there's opportunities to participate with that story enough. Like, you know, we talked about this earlier about, you know, there's a reason people are dressing up as Jedis or knights or whatever and going to these places. There's something that draws them to it. And the faith is no different. Like, if you kind of call people of what it means to follow the Eucharist, what it means to eat it, and all the stories that are around it, people want to interact with it. But if you don't treat it in that reverence, like in that action also while telling that, then it's not going to work. I feel like, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, I haven't been in like Byzantine liturgies long enough to like fully understand. I know their theology and stuff, but I don't see it how their you can say audience looks at it yet. But with Roman Catholicism, I just find that, for example, you know, there's this whole concept about like the trueness of the Eucharist, right? Like what it is. And you can beat it over people's heads and constantly tell them it's real, like it's really Jesus. But if you're not approaching it and acting out as if it was really Jesus, no one's going to listen to you. Do you know what I mean by that? Like,
Yeah.
you can constantly tell and teach people and have lectures about and all the proofs of how it's actually Christ's body and blood. But if you're not approaching it in that same manner, like acting out, you can say the play of that story, that it's real, no one's going to listen. Like, no one's going to listen to you, whether you have the facts or not, because we don't work through analytical data. We get inspired by story and how we can interact with it.
Yeah. Like when I started doing Adoration Guardians, or I became one, I love doing it. I do it with a lot of old Hispanic women who go in and they're just like on their faces, like there's nobody in the room but them and Jesus. And I'm like, how different would my life be if I had faith like them? Like, I know it's something you kind of build up over time and it doesn't happen overnight, but like to know like the God, like the flesh of God is like right before you, like that is so like something we just take for granted too. And maybe it has to do with how we've just changed the way we worship over the past Vatican II stuff. I don't know, and like how we just treat it so casually. But I don't know. Yeah, I feel like that's like what you were saying, like how we just kind of dumb down the world into this very materialist way of thinking, that something like that is just so beyond. Like the Eucharist is just, I feel like that's like the final frontier of the faith, where it's like, how do you explain that? How do you explain mermaids? It's like God is in that piece of bread, but it's real. Like that's, I don't even know for that.
I always fight with people with language about that, because people always say it's not a symbol, and you can say it's kind of like that I'm just talking semantics or something, but I think it's important. Like, man is a symbol, like me and you are symbols, right? Like, we're an image of God, and we were made from heaven and earth, right? Like the joining of two things, and we're like a symbol of God. But no one would deny our existence. And so there's that whole thought with Protestants and stuff where they're like, oh, the Eucharist is just a symbol. And then Catholics are like, no, it's literally God. And I'm like, well, I think we're using that long language, because by saying that, we're submitting that only that is material matters, and then vice versa, kind of, we're reducing that meaning is important. Like, that meaning is also has a substance or a mass, you can say. And so I say it is a symbol, but it's the symbol of symbols. Like, it's the symbol. Because Christ took on the image of man, and he took on you can say, the symbol of man, and made it into fruition. And so it is a symbol. And then the other problem you have is then, if we're only looking for the literal, which by the literal means by the book, by the way, it doesn't mean like actuality or whatever. But how do you explain angels? Because I would argue that literally angels are real.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because if you're saying that the Eucharist is not symbol, it's like actually God there, then are angels just like these metaphors or symbols too? Because I'm pretty sure they have a real body too. We just can't see it.
Yeah.
I don't know if my kind of like makes sense what I'm trying to kind of like point out there.
Well, I guess what it ultimately boils down to is God just really wants us to trust him. Kind of like when we were talking about Isaac and Abraham and the tests that God puts us through. And if you just focus on the life of Christ and everything that he says, that just clicks. Like, you find bits and pieces of Christ in Buddhism, Star Wars, Batman, and you just follow him, and he takes you on this journey, and you finally get to the part where he talks about the Eucharist, and that's when people are like, all right, I'm done. This is crazy. But I love the way Saint Therese said it in her book, where somebody asked her, maybe it was her sister, like, why is God in a piece of bread? And she was like, because he can do whatever he wants. And that's just the mystery. It's like, just he's brought you this far. He's done this much for you in your life. He I can't explain, like, when saints come to me in a way, like when you talk to me about painting Muirgen and what I went through with that, like the journey, and now I'm talking to somebody else about painting Our Lady of Knock, who I've been seeing all over the place. Like, I can't explain that, but if he's done this much for me at this point, I'm just gonna, okay, yeah, that's you in that piece of bread, and I'm going to treat it with respect and trust that maybe someday I'll get to the point like those abuelas who are on their faces. And I want to get to that point. Like, I think all humans have that desire to worship. Like, we want to get on our faces and worship something. And if it's not Christ in the form of bread, it's going to be an OnlyFans girl or a Jedi or something just as ridiculous. Like, it's just as embarrassing to do all the religious stuff at Comic-Con as it is in a church. So you might as well do the one that makes you have peace. Because, I mean, if Buddha brought you the level of peace that I feel when I'm painting an icon, then I'd be like, okay, yeah, like, we can talk about it. But I don't think that that's obvious for other people who are just trying to look for worship in all the wrong places.
Yeah. One more thing I want to mention before we slowly start wrapping up here is another reason why I feel like a saint like Muirgen is very important is because, we mentioned before that we're living in a crazy world, like a world of monsters to some extent. And traditionally speaking, you defeated a monster with a monster, right? Like that's why the traditional churches had gargoyles on the outside of them. And that's also the reason why a ship would have a mermaid out front. And in Greek cultures, like outside people's houses, they would have the face of Medusa. It was like, that's how you keep the bad spirits out, was with a monster to some extent, right? Like, it's your own cherubim guarding your own gates to your soul. And obviously, and God takes kind of like, you can say, sometimes the broken monsters and allows them to serve him. So to me, when you read Noah's Ark, and in general, like symbolically speaking, the ship is always like the church. Mm-hmm. And so Muirgen to me is like that on the front of the church's vessel, you can say, and she's the one that's kind of like guarding it. And I think we're at that point where we're at the edge, where it's like it's up to Saint Muirgen, it's up to Saint Christopher, it's Saint George, the Dragon Slayer, like all those weird ones have to fight this weirdness and let them take care of it, right? They're the giant slayers, all those guys that we kind of ignored for all these years. It's like we're at this point where like we kind of need those weirdos, you can say, to help fight the other weirdos.
I love that. I got goosebumps. I want to bring Muirgen, like we're bringing them back into their roles.
Yeah, like bring her memory back. Yeah, that's how I felt. There was last thing I'll say, I shared her, I'm on the forum on the Symbolic World, and they have one about icons and art or something, and I shared her on there, and I wrote how much I loved her, and I said, Mary Huber painted her for me. And there was a woman on there that replied to me and asked what an icon means to me, kind of like what I asked you earlier. Mm-hmm. And so I responded, I said, it's about and she asked why this one in particular is so important to me. And I just said, I think icons are for veneration and basically a window of heaven that leads us up to higher things and hopefully up to God. And it leads us into a life of prayer. But this one's important to me because I feel like, she almost picked me to bring her memory back. You know what I mean? Like, she's kind of lost. The only thing is that stone tablet and stuff. And kind of like through me participating with you and stuff, like we're bringing her memory back. And I kind of got a little emotional, like, as I was typing this up. But she gave me this long reply saying, like, that's so beautiful. She gave me some technicalities about an actual icon, gave me some like orthodox passage of that an icon is more of a form of prayer than just like painting or anything like that. And so, but yeah, I mean, it was like a kind of like a beautiful interaction because she was like testing me almost like, why is this happening? But I almost felt like Saint Muirgen was almost asking me that through her, you know what I mean? Like, why did you respond? And so I told her, but what's it called? I mean, hopefully people will see it. I'll put the image up on the frame as we're talking about it, and I'll put it up now also so you can see it again. But I am really, I mean, even if like, but through technicality, she's not considered an icon or whatever. What's it called? For me, she got blessed and everything. And so like, for me, it's like a holy image. So hopefully it's like, helps people kind of like re-enchant the world and stuff is kind of like what I like to do.
I mean, just hearing you say that makes me feel like that's part of the process. Like it's like I made this child and I give her away to her new family so that she can do her work. And that's exactly what's like, she's coming out through you and your work, and that's what's making her real. And yeah, it's just, that makes me feel so fulfilled. Like, this is why I want to do this. Like, I want to bring these windows to these lesser known, weird, freaky saints and have them just kind of be our assembling our Avengers team for what lays ahead. So I just love that. That's so beautiful. I'm so happy that I was able to help bring her to you, your homegirl.
Yeah, me too. What is and so Mary, if anyone wants to look at other, like, more of your work or kind of like follow along with you, where can they kind of find you and look at the work and follow along?
I have a website, which is just my name, Mary Elizabeth, which is the Visitation, Huber. And then my Instagram is where I'm starting to post like my process videos of my paintings, and as I explore different mediums and just learn about these different saints and as they come to me. So I've noticed if I just let go and let them come, like, the journey just feels more organic and more interesting. So anybody who wants to follow along, they can just see me at m.e.huber on Instagram.
Cool. And then I'll have it in the notes on the bottom too. Man, it feels so weird saying that, all this kind of like YouTube lingo stuff.
Click the bell.
But thank you for coming on. And it's so, yeah, I mean, I feel like it was almost like this idea of like destiny, the fact that you showed up at St. John's that one day, and then I found that you did paintings, and I found Muirgen, and it was just like all just flowed. It just kind of happened perfectly. It's like no one else was meant to almost paint her, but like you.
So, I know. Yeah. I have to show you later all of my mermaid drawings from college and how my destiny just kind of came to this one moment. Just like Irish mermaids. Now it's like, that's all I want to draw anymore. So thank you so much for ushering that into my life.
Yeah, no problem. Well, yeah, thank you for watching, everybody. Let me know what you guys think, and follow Mary. Her work is beautiful, and commission stuff from her.